Kia ora and welcome to the programme. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative based here in New Zealand. Webinar episode 4 of 7. Taken together, these 7 webinars plus 5 films, which we throw in as well, form the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative 2021 annual conference. The top line theme for all 12 of those offerings is conversations that help regulatory practice and regulatory stewardship. My name's Ian Kaplan and I'm from the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative. And if you're watching us live or indeed later on the recorded versions of this webinar, which will come out as a box set in December, don't forget your Christmas shopping, wherever and whenever you are, and I should say wherever you are, given that our guests here today are from Manchester, Canberra and Amsterdam, and I know a number of you are not just from New Zealand, wherever and whenever you are, I make no apology for saying this. Every episode, members of the audience, you're very welcome here. The top line theme is conversations. And today it's international trend-setting conversations. And I'm not just talking about the snazzy backgrounds that I've got and my guests have got relative to some other backgrounds that you could get. And I'm not talking professional backgrounds, I'm talking kind of virtual studio backgrounds. The international dimension is profound and has been going for some years. I quote one very distinguished public servant who said that they wanted to, quote, spotlight the needs to continue training public servants to emphasize the value of their maintaining up-to-date competence, renewing their relationships with the scholars and researchers who are in their field of specialty, extending the frontiers of knowledge. Now, just to get you warmed up, members of the audience, which distinguished Anglo-American public servant said this? Your prologue poll and your time starts now. Was it Sir Ernest Gowers who wrote Plain Words, which is probably the raciest Her Majesty's Stationery Office publication outside the Profumo report in 1962? Was it John F. Kennedy, who needs no introduction? Or was it Stafford Northcote, in fact, Sir Stafford Northcote, who did the Hit Parade Civil Service report, the Northcote Trevelyan report in 1854? And in many ways is the founding father of the modern Westminster civil service system. I can see the polls raging. Could be Staffy, 47%. Let's just hold it there and see how we go. All right, I think I'm going to declare it without the need of Supreme Court intervention because there's a clear majority in favour of Stafford Northcote, later Sir Stafford Northcote, later Lord Iddlesey. The answer, in fact, is John F. Kennedy, whose untimely passing we, of course, recall and acknowledge today in 1963. This remark came from him when he was a senator in the 50s. And perhaps on a cheerier note, it's nice to say that we can be joined by some of Kennedy's, quote, scholars and researchers, and much, much more. To join us now, my 3 guests on International Trend-Setting Conversations, who are Professor Grant Pink of the University of Tasmania, who'll be known to many GREG conference goers, as is Professor Jeroen van der Heyden, the Chair in Regulatory Practice from the Victoria University of Wellington, at the moment in Amsterdam, and Marshall Boo, who has a double-barreled office, the non-executive chair of the UK Institute of Regulation, and the Chief Executive of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Gentlemen, a really warm welcome to you both. It's great to have you on. I should say, members of the audience, before we jump into conversation, it's a family show. You're part of the conversation. Not the chat, but the Q&A function is where you can talk with the guests, with me, with each other. Feel free to jump in. We'll want you in the conversation. We want to have a discussion with you. But I've just got perhaps a question to just really briefly kick us off. And I'll go to Grant first and we'll go round the table. And that's this. I think we've got about 400 odd people who initially registered for this. And they're saying, perhaps, I'm a domestic New Zealand regulator. Grant, I'm watching this program as a domestic New Zealand regulator. This is called international trend setting. How does it apply to me?
Thank you, Ian, and good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. I think the first thing I'd say as a regulatory practitioner and a regulatory professional, we need to be at and ahead of our game as best we possibly can. But of course, with the books in the background, I think we need to think about some definitions. So what initially comes to mind to me is it trendy or is it trend setting? If it's trendy and it's just shiny and not a lot of substance, beware. However, if it's trend setting and you are setting the trend and you are building and creating a movement that others can build upon, then it's something worth investing in. They'd be my comments, Ian.
Thank you, Grant. And before we go to Jeroen, it is just worth saying that all three of my guests put me in the shade because they're all authors. They're variously titled books of the Public Sector Fox, Navigating Regulatory Language, and A to Z Guide, and Innovations in Urban Climate Governance. And there's much more. They'll tell you about those. The best I can do is an article I wrote for a newspaper years ago about a libel action called I Like the Verdict So Much I Bought the Jury. That won't be in all good bookstores now. Jeroen, to you, how do we make this relatable?
Thanks, Ian, and kia ora, everybody. Look, I think sort of the obvious answer that you will get from me here is that, of course, regulation is not something that only happens in New Zealand. And regulation, of course, is not a truly uniquely a Kiwi way of steering society. Regulation, as we know, is as old as mankind is. It happens all around the world. And a lot of the problems that we are facing in New Zealand are quite similar to those that people face elsewhere. And many of the solutions that we choose in New Zealand, we can also find elsewhere. So looking over the border, in part, we can learn a lot from what is happening elsewhere. If it is in a different country or perhaps even in a different time. And that can then help us to improve what we are doing in New Zealand, but also elsewhere. And I would say, even if you're not looking over the border to try to improve your own performance, then sometimes just speaking over the border will at least be helpful to put things in perspective, to understand that you are not the only one out there with either the problem or the solution or a combination of those.
Thank you, Jeroen. We're not alone, are we, Marshall? There's a lot we can learn by, I guess, looking outside our own borders and looking outside our own sectors. What would the Public Sector Fox say to that? And I'm not saying that's you, Marshall, but perhaps it's a link into you telling me who he or she is.
Well, the Public Sector Fox, you referenced it already, Ian, and good morning, everybody who's watching, is a book about public sector management that I wrote. But I just want to echo what Jeroen said about the importance of looking beyond borders, because all of us working in regulation are facing similar problems. We may work in different geographical areas and different sectors too, but all of us, I suspect, are grappling with issues of how to deal with non-compliance, how to impose sanctions that are fair, but also encourage better behavior in the future, how to promote improvement. All of these are very, very similar dilemmas that we're facing, exactly as Jeroen said, but also there's increasingly a need to think about regulation in a broader way too, beyond our own geographies, because there are aspects of a globalized world that need regulation that can't really be contained within domestic boundaries anymore. For example, of course, the environment, the climate, the oceans, the internet, social media, and globalized finance as well. So for all of these reasons, I think it's really important that regulators look beyond their own domestic boundaries and link up with people around the world.
Thank you, gentlemen. That's a lovely introduction. I'm just going to jump in to yourself, Jeroen, because one of the things that you do, of course, as chair, is produce a series of films, which I'd like to hear. I think the audience would like to hear more about, and masterclasses. We've all got something in common. You've all said that. How does the commonality convert to practical tools? Jeroen, start with you, if we may.
Yeah, thanks again, Ian. Look, I think sort of coming back to that previous answer, very often in regulation, if you have a problem, if you have a challenge, if you step back and look at the larger picture, you see that broader solutions to regulatory problems can often be applied in a lot of contexts. So these contexts can be different countries, different parts of the country, as Marshall says, different policy areas. But it is important, I think, and that is something that I always try to get across in the work that I'm producing, it is important to understand the essence of different regulatory problems and different regulatory solutions. So for instance, understand the essence of risk-based regulation or the essence of responsive regulation. And understanding that essence is as important for the, let's say, the chief executive of maritime as it is to a front regulator of, say, the Environmental Protection Authority. So it is really about understanding the essence of regulation. And that is indeed what I seek to get across in the various training programs that I'm involved in within GREC and elsewhere within the Victoria University of Wellington, for example. And that training indeed ranges from providing training to board members, to frontline workers, to everybody involved in the GREC community. And that training, I think, is truly important. You can participate in the GREC qualifications, for which you could get credentials, or other training programs, sort of the master classes that I produce. But whether or not you aim for that kind of training or the upskilling of your knowledge, whether or not you want that to get credentials or not, I think the real importance here is that you go into these topics and try to understand what is the essence of the problem that I'm interested in. What is the essence of the solution that people are providing, and why do you need to know that essence? I think it is that at the end of the day, and I'm going to build a bridge to Grant here, at the end of the day, it is to allow us to speak the same language and to make sure that if we communicate across problems, across different regulatory problems, and across different regulatory areas, that we speak the same thing, talk about the same problems and the same solutions, so that we can actually learn from each other and leverage off each other. And I think this is a nice opening ground to you.
Thank you. Very nice pass, Jeroen. I mean, of course, I thought about this question, but I'm also listening actively to what Jeroen's saying, and I think it is the commonality we have. So quite often I'll be talking to regulators and saying, regulation is regulation is regulation. Don't look for points of difference. Look for the commonality. Look what you can leverage. So, for example, commonly all regulators will do some form of advice and guidance, giving information to regulated entities to make sure they can comply and comply easily. Licensing and approval, some sort of licensing authorization regime. Is it standard conditions? Is it bespoke conditions? Moving into monitoring compliance, are we doing audits, inspections, or investigation? They have very, very common components. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from our colleagues. And finally, in enforcement, that prosecution and litigation action we take. We might not run a lot of cases, but other people do. We can learn about those things. So I think it is looking for those areas of commonality and leaning into it, as opposed to saying we're special and different. Ian's mentioned the book. Jeroen has mentioned language, and that was actually the driving force for why I wrote my book, because I thought we need to come together. But the first step of coming together, in line with this series, Ian, is conversations. And conversations you need to speak. So my book is about navigating regulatory language. It's an A to Z guide, and it just takes you through 500 or so topics and words, which says, well, if you're in immigration and you use this word, what do you mean in tax? What do you mean in the Environment Department? If we're working together, first step, let's understand each other. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, Grant. And before we go to Marshall, I mean, I think it's really important to point out the commonality of language in a completely different discipline. Unearthing fossils and skeletons, I saw on the BBC a few weeks ago. Somebody used apparently there was an issue as to whether or not the correct terminology may or may not have been used, which could have caused a difference of opinion over thousands of years of evolution. It's critical we get the language right, whatever discipline we're in, or at least if there's any issue that the language isn't in accord, not least in the coercive or anything else with powers of the state. Marshall, to you, how do we, with this commonality of language, do cross-border regulation, the international frame from the twin seats that you have in particular? What do you say?
How do we do cross-border regulation? The first thing, as Grant says, is we need to talk to each other, because jurisdictions differ, laws differ, the remit of organizations differ, even if they're regulating the same area. So all of this adds a lot of complexity and difficulty. And of course, we can't forget the politics, because all of us work, we're all fortunate to live in democracies. That's a good thing. But living in democracies means working with politicians, and they've got obviously different agendas. They come from different backgrounds, and we need to make sure that we can both be respectful of the democratic process, but also understand that there are some things that just need to carry on in terms of applying rules, making sure that compliance happens, being fair, that are not in themselves political processes. So, we as regulators, in my view, need to understand the politics, but we need to work through that in order to make sure that we're regulating effectively across national boundaries.
Thank you, Marshall. Thank you, gentlemen. Members of the audience, a very warm welcome to you if you've just joined us. And I notice that some of you perhaps we have Marshall Booth, Professor Jeroen van der Heyden and Professor Grant Pink with us today. A number of you have put down some questions and comments. I'll invite you to just vote or add them, just so you can see them whizzing across the screen so we can put one or two to our guests. Open fire on that, members of the audience. I can see some of you already have. And in the meantime, I'm just going to fox you even further as a local public sector fox and put up a little mood poll just to see how you're getting on. That should be the popcorn poll coming up any second now. Okay, which song connotes how you're feeling at the moment? Now, this may be the state of the planet rather than the state of the conference. But I think let's construe it as a state of the conference before any of you put frustrated too much. But not that I'm trying to skew the voting. Let's just deal with Neil's question. And I will just throw this out. You can all see it, gentlemen. Have the three guests seen the groundswell protests to regulation, climate change, and can they comment? And it is an area of delicacy. But I guess the broader issue of climate change and regulation. And I know, Jeroen, you're a published author of Vis-a-vis Urban Climate Governance. Perhaps you'd like to kick off.
Thank you very much for that one. Look, regulation for climate change or regulation in the area of climate change is a very difficult one. So let's not go into the details and the subtleties here. What I think, what we are seeing with climate change is partly relatable actually to what we are seeing with the COVID-19 crisis. We have a future unknown state for which we have quite a lot of knowledge, about which we have quite a lot of knowledge already. We need to make major changes to our lifestyles to prevent the problem from becoming larger, same as with COVID. But we humans are very much biased to sticking to what we are, to what we know. So when it comes to climate change, I think one of the things that regulators can learn about, specifically if we look sort of at international developments, is really thinking beyond that traditional approach of we perhaps need to say what society needs to do. And if they don't do it, then we're going to fine them for not doing it. We probably have to begin thinking with climate change, but also with the COVID-19 response, much more in terms of how can we truly change people's behavior? Do we actually really understand why people behave in the way they do currently? And is our traditional understanding of still very often a deterrence-based approach, so we introduce fines and penalties for non-compliance, is that actually the smartest way to make people reduce car use, to make people reduce their consumption, to increase recycling and whatnot? So is there a way for regulators, I would say, to make compliance with these sort of rules that you need to have in place to reduce carbon emissions and whatnot? Is there a way for regulators to make compliance with these kinds of rules easy? And is there a way for regulators to explain in a better way than what we've been doing for a long time to the public at large why this is so important? If that is something we can do in the future, then we might be on a better trajectory.
Thank you, Jeroen. I'll just take that straight to Marshall with the twin question from Wendy, because I think that's inextricably related. Thank you, Wendy. Good to see you. Is there an argument, looking at what Jeroen's just said, and I know Grant will talk about relationships in a moment, for an international regulatory body for global regulatory issues? From where you sit, Marshall, what do you say to that?
Well, I'd say yes. No doubt about it. You know, regulation is about regulating systems. That's what it is. You know, it's a system. We need to understand the system as a whole. In some of our areas of regulation, there's a domestic system. You know, there are laws that are domestic and they need to be applied and all of that. But the climate is a global system. It's not in one country alone, and so that absolutely requires there to be global regulation, in my view, because regulation is about ensuring compliance. And it's to make sure that there are penalties for people who break the rules. And if there's a global system, which is what the climate is, then obviously those people who do comply want to make sure that the people elsewhere in the world are penalized or certainly held to account if they don't comply with the rules and they damage the environment that is ours all of ours. So I can't see any alternative personally than some kind of global system that enables regulatory compliance. But clearly that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to achieve in practice.
And I guess, Marshall, thank you for that. It takes time. And Grant, I think to a point that we were going to talk about as well, having been on the Friday webinar about regulating specific sectors, gambling, consumer credit, competition. If you don't necessarily have the international teeth, if I can put it that way, or perhaps you don't see yourself as an internationally reaching domestic regulator, what is the value of having the importance of having international relationships and cultivating them nonetheless?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. I think for me, international networks are critically important, but it is easy for people's default position to say, I work in local government, or it's not for me, it's somebody else's job. But I think to Jeroen and Marshall's point, climate change, COVID itself shows that we're all interconnected across this regulatory system. And it's about identifying, carving out our place in that system and making our contribution. So I would, my opening statement about the importance of these networks would be they're about partnering, preparing and practicing. So partnering people who are going to spill the same regulatory blood in the same regulatory mud. It's about preparing in peacetime before your crisis occurs. And it's about practicing. It's honing your regulatory craft, because it's a skill which can be learned and practiced. I mean, many of your viewers would know that I've been actively researching networks for over a decade now, and I've been involved in local, national, international networks. Now, admittedly, as life imitates art, they were all around environmental regulation, because that's where I was working at the time. So I've been involved in Trans-Tasman ones with New Zealand, ones in Europe across the EU, global based in America, and then finally in areas of transnational environmental crime, which I think is important to the conversation we just had. It's about cross-cutting crime. It's not just the active action, wrongdoing in its own right, but it had that flow-on effect across our economic, environmental, and social regulatory roles. So I think, to go back to those just very briefly, each of them, they're invaluable, because you're speaking to people who've gone through what you're about to go through, and you can draw on those similarities, which I think that Jeroen spoke about. The second thing about the networks is that they're very good, but we need to also be mindful they have similarities and differences with communities of practice. So my point there for the viewers would be, networks tend to focus on the higher level generic things such as training, policies and procedures. What's generic? What can we learn? Not cut and paste, but what can we make some quick ground on? Communities of practice are more organic, and if we have time, I might talk some more about them later. I think the third point is that networks are like any relationship. They need to be built and maintained. People help people they know. People help people who help them. People help people who they trust and respect. That's not to say networks are transactional, but they are definitely relational. And I would encourage people to build, maintain, and sustain these relationships.
That's brilliant. Grant, let's just take a pause there if we may, because I can see some questions going really on point to what you're saying. Before I go to those, one of the questions with a significant amount of votes is, can GREG provide links to the books of these presenters in the follow-up email? The answer is absolutely yes. We will be doing that by means of website and or separate communications. So hold your horses there. We'll get that information out to you. And there's 240 odd people who are very interested in that. I just want to riff off what Grant has been talking about to Lee's question, which is heavily upvoted relatively here. And it's, are there any new trends that arise from the relationship that Grant was talking about from overseas regulatory activities that it would be useful for us to know about here in Aotearoa, New Zealand? Marshall, to you.
Goodness. Well, in all of the time that I've been working in the public sector, many decades now, I have to say that New Zealand has been one of the leaders actually in public administration, and it's often been where I've come for good ideas, I have to say.
Yeah.
So I suspect that that those of you watching this broadcast actually have a good idea of what the trends are, because because you're thinking about these issues in New Zealand on the whole, as much as anybody else in the world, I would say. So so keep on going. Having a network such as this, I think, is a trendsetter, to go back to a phrase that was used right at the beginning. So I would just encourage you to take up Grant's offer of building networks amongst yourselves and internationally, because I suspect that you already know some of the answers to these questions, but certainly these cross-border issues that we've just been talking about is absolutely the frontier that all of us need to be addressing.
Thank you, Marshall.
Ian, may I just quickly add to that?
Of course you can.
I'm on the record saying a number of times that if I could combine two countries, it would be New Zealand and the Netherlands. I think their attitude and approach and innovation, and I think humbleness as well, to regulatory systems and approaches is second to none. And I'm not saying that because of who's on the panel, but it's genuine when you look at my research and writings. I think part of it is due to their size. They have to make it work. There is no plan B. And also the two tiers of government doesn't hurt either. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. And Jeroen, I was going to come to you while we work up the terms and conditions of Grant's unification treaty. I just want to pick up on Mike's question, which is, are we too small in New Zealand in terms of relative size to necessarily take the lead and be the trend setter, and are we an automatic trend follower? Is there a nimbleness that we can coin?
That's a fantastic question. I think that when we talk about trendsetters or leaders and followers, that we shouldn't make the mistake that you have to be a leader or a trendsetter across the board. You can very well be a leader or a trendsetter in one area and a follower in other areas. And I think that's something that we really need to keep in the back of our minds. So absolutely, New Zealand seems to be trendsetting when it comes to ideas around regulatory stewardship. So this idea that we think about reforming regulatory systems and maintaining the quality of regulatory systems, something that you in principle could do in each and every size country, but specifically in New Zealand because we are so small, because the lines in government are quite short actually. So I don't think New Zealand is too small to be an international trendsetter. In other areas where you perhaps need more space, more size to really test if a specific regulatory intervention holds in different contextual settings, New Zealand might be better off being a trend taker. So think, for instance, about risk regulation. Countries like the United States or regions such as Europe have such a broad variety that we can get a better understanding where risk-based regulation is a good plan and where it is not. So that would be something I think to keep in the back of our minds. We don't have to be trendsetters across the board. It is really enough to be trendsetter in a small thing.
Thank you. And Marshall, to you, because I know you were close in Downing Street in the Blair administration, and I think institutionally there are a lot of looks over to New Zealand as to how New Zealand was doing things. That's limb one of the question. Limb two, I'm going to sneak in here from Harry in the audience. Have you seen best practice in regulatory impact analysis changing internationally? So perhaps we can talk about Tony Blair first and then RIAs next.
Well, I worked in the Downing Street delivery unit back in the Tony Blair days, where we were then implementing new public management essentially in the UK, the use of targets, better use of data, all of that good stuff that I know was happening in New Zealand exactly at the same time. So yes, I mean, that's where I first became aware of some of the good stuff that was happening in New Zealand, and obviously things have moved on since then, and we've become much more sophisticated in our understanding of how to use tools like those of new public management in the public sector. And in my view, regulation is another tool. It wasn't talked about 20 years ago in the same way. It was not part of the delivery landscape back in the Tony Blair days in the UK, but it is the cutting edge now, in my view. It's a massively powerful tool to improve public services. I happen to have spent my professional career in public services rather than regulating business or other things. and I'm regulating equality legislation now to make sure that people and firms aren't discriminatory. So that's my particular regulatory background, but regulation is a really powerful force for positive change. And I don't think that public policy as a whole, and certainly not democratic politics, they haven't realized, we ourselves haven't realized to a degree, how we can maximize the potential of this tool, which is regulation.
Thank you, Marshall. We have 1 minute to go, and I just wanted to ask our guests to choose one word. They've published and written many, just one word that resonates in the context of this topic for them to sign off, and very briefly, why. Grant, over to you.
There's 500, Ian.
You've got a book of them.
Yeah. You'll have to come back to me. And I was thinking something else. But while I've got the mic, I think we heard on Monday about the 1,000 cups of tea. What I would say is I believe in the 3 cups of tea. The first cup of tea you have as a stranger, the second you have it as a friend, and the third one you have it as an honoured guest. And I think to continue these conversations, just keep talking. So maybe my answer is just communicate and converse.
Lovely. Thank you, Grant. Jeroen, what about you? What's your cup of tea?
Watershed would be mine, and that is we are truly in a watershed sort of phase in the history of at least mankind. You could probably say lots of things are happening, but also lots of taken for granted assumptions have been blown away from under us. Climate change has shown us that lots of things that we've been doing for a long time aren't really smart. COVID has shown us the same thing. That is the very obvious stuff. But at the same time, we see that lots of assumptions about why people behave in the way they behave, that we've built up over hundreds, if not thousands of years, have begun to get challenged over the last 20 years. And I would say in the next decades ahead, that is really going to affect regulatory governance and regulatory practice. Why do people do the things they do? And we think we know, but honestly, we don't.
Very much a lesson in humility, Jeroen. Thank you. And final pithy words, I think, Marshall, given the time from yourself.
Well, one word: persevere. Regulation is hard. You're dealing, all of you watching this call, you're dealing with people, not the ones who comply, want to do the right thing, but those who don't. It's not easy, and you'll come up against all kinds of obstacles, I'm sure. But keep going. It's really important what you do, and good luck.
Thank you, Marshall, and thank you, Grant, and thank you, Jeroen, and thank you, members of the audience. To you, a couple of plugs before we go. Tomorrow, Tuesday, we've got the Regulatory Assurance and Stewardship Forum. It's not strictly a GREG gig, but it's done through the Ministry of Primary Industries with Keith Manch, who, of course, will be known as a conference speaker here last week, and will be appearing and is appearing on the films, the GREG films, which accompany this conference, which are out on the GREG website. He'll be on a wellbeing one, which goes out this evening, the freedom to make decisions in the appropriate climate. So do take a look at the films, and do also please take a look at the link, which I'm going to ask John Kaiser if he's on the call to send you the link. But otherwise, in any event, we'll publicize that separately. We're back on Wednesday talking about frontline conversations and a particular educational format in which capability is looked after in a particular type of way. More on that on Wednesday. Wherever and whenever you are, stay safe, stay well. And until next time, thank you for joining us, and ka kite amo.